welcome to our fourth session or our third time slot. For those who have just come and joined us, welcome. We are very, very excited to be hosting the Australian Educational Research Podcasting Conference here at Swinburne University of Technology, sponsored by the School of Social Sciences, Media, Film and Education and the Swinburne Adobe Creative Campus. I'm here with my co-hosts, Mia, Claire, and I am delighted that we will talk very, very soon on a really hot topic with some wonderful presenters. But before we transition into that, I would just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and their elders, past, present and emerging, and who they are known as the traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne's Australian campuses are located. They're also the lands of which I am currently zooming in. I want to also acknowledge the traditional lands of those that each of you are zooming in on as well. In this session, our Thinking in Conversation, the Power of Listening with Hearts, we have another 4 amazing presentations with Mim and Ben, Britta, Liz and Christy and Ash. And Mia and I are going to co-chair this session. And again, for those who haven't been with us for our other previous sessions, we're very much embracing a community of mutual respect where we're engaging with and listening to the live presentations, but we are also engaging with the chat at the same time, asking questions, maybe presenting a commentary, thoughts as our presenters speak as well. And we have many of us who are here to engage and very much embrace that occurring. So let me stop sharing, and we want to just get all organized here with our first presenters.
Narelle, let me just jump in before you do that while you're getting yourself organized, because we are talking about listening, and Siobhan in her keynote really focused on storytelling, but also the importance of thinking through your ears. And I thought this would be a nice place just to read a quote. So both, as you know in this room, radio and podcasts both rely on the human imagination. Listeners can create their own imagery, their own versions of the characters in the story. And there's a radio scholar, a very seminal radio scholar, Andrew Crisell, who in 1994 talked about imagination being a prerequisite for radio storytelling. And of course, I would argue that that's also true for podcasting. And he writes, "So integral does the imagination seem to be to the way in which we decode virtually all its messages, whether factual or fictional, that when we speak of its appeal to the imagination, we mean in effect its basic ability to communicate," end quote. So I thought that was a good place to start when we talk about listening.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mia. And lovely transition. And I'm just finding Ben on the screen so I can, there we go, spotlight you as well. Wonderful. So very much looking forward to your presentation. I'll hand it over to you, Mim and Ben.
Thank you so much, Narelle and Mia. And it is great to be here with you all. So my name's Mim Fox and my presenter this evening is Ben Joseph. And we are social work academics and researchers from the University of Wollongong and the University of Western Sydney. And we're speaking to you today about the Social Work Stories podcast. And our team is made up of ourselves and our friends and practitioner colleagues, Liz Murphy and Justin Stesh, who we understand are here with us as well, somewhere in this crowd. It's important for us as social work academics to acknowledge that we're speaking to you from the Gabby and the Eagle lands, which span across the Eora Nation. We acknowledge wholeheartedly that these are unceded lands that speak witness to stories of past and present pain, heartache and removal due to invasion and colonisation, but that also speak of resilience, pride and sustained culture of the traditional custodians of these places. And so we acknowledge and pay our respects to these people now. And thank you for your time and attendance in hearing about the work we've been doing with our Social Work Stories podcast since our launch in 2018. So the Social Work Stories podcast showcases real social work cases from around Australia and the world. And these cases are told by anonymous social workers, with the stories being de-identified so as to protect the identities and stories of the practitioners and their colleagues and their clients. And in each episode, we delve into the real lives of Australia's most vulnerable and marginalised peoples. And we hear stories of disaster, heartbreak and sadness, as well as joy, success and perseverance. As social workers, we recognise the importance of social justice, advocacy, anti-oppressive practice, and we always work our best towards reducing harm. And this doesn't change when we get behind the mic and when we give witness to these important stories that we're sharing. The focus of each of our episodes is of the on-the-ground realities of being a contemporary social worker across the many varied and diverse sectors of community welfare and development across Australia and globally as the podcast has grown. Our two hosts debrief each story, highlighting and expanding on the pertinent social work themes, such as theory to practice models, managing self-care, professional and personal development, navigating ethical dilemmas, the importance of social work supervision, and promoting social justice. While the hosts are busy doing that, the producers and editors are focusing on crafting ethically minded narratives with the hosts, where they're contributing to the story arc and the overall episode content, while they're also managing the delivery of each episode and the ongoing technical maintenance.
Thanks, Mim. The Social Work Stories podcast came up through discussion regarding what we would like to hear social workers talking about, the kind of conversations social workers have with each other in the tea room. We also saw a gap in social work education, particularly for social work students, and the questions they had regularly about practice. And we wanted to change the often negative social work narrative and portrayal in the media. While the podcast is a volunteer-run project, there has been grant-based funding for the podcast at times, with a residency at the University of Wollongong's iAccelerate program back in 2019. UOW has been the major patron of the podcast, but New South Wales Health is also supporting a sister project at the moment. Let's talk about impact. The podcast has become a purposeful and purpose-made environment for social workers at emerging, established, and expert stages of their careers. We believe we've created in this podcast a virtual community filled with social workers and general public listeners, with a particular focus on social work students, as well as practitioners in the field. How do we know this is our community? Well, through the abundance of correspondence with listeners and contributors from around the world via emails, social media, online ratings and reviews, in-person feedback, and funding opportunities. With this in mind, we believe that the impact of our podcast can be articulated with three key ideas: the opportunity to experience social work community, the opportunity for social work supervision, and the opportunity for social work mentorship. Let's talk a little bit about community first. Many listeners are social workers and students who comment on the podcast feeling like a community, with lots of people saying that they feel like they know our hosts, Mim and Liz, and they can connect closely with the stories of the anonymous social workers that they listen to. We're often receiving emails and DMs from social work students and practitioners and others, non-social workers, to say thank you, to comment on particular personal highlights, to offer similar stories of their own, asking for career advice or practice advice. And they often say to us that they now realize that they aren't alone in their experience as being a social worker anymore. When social work students or practitioners make suggestions for areas of practice they'd like to see showcased, or social workers they would like to see included as contributors, we make sure that we follow up and then highlight in the episodes those comments that we've received. We realize that there aren't too many opportunities for academics and students and practitioners and the general public to all be listening and commenting and promoting social work as a profession at the same time, within the same context, the same forum. And we think this podcast connects people in this way. It unites people within the social work framework and through the story shared. and it supports people in practice while witnessing their professional and student experiences. Not only are we talking about a community of contributors and listeners, but also within the team itself is a community. We're a diverse bunch of social workers with students joining us on placements and internships for extended periods to help build the episodes and the pod. They are integral to the podcast's evolution and ongoing success. Once the students leave us, they stay connected via the podcast and through social media. They remain a big part of who we are. And we think this is not just a podcasting team, but a community.
Let's talk about supervision, which is an integral part to social work practice. So many social work practitioners and social work students on their field placement find themselves in isolated social work roles in interdisciplinary teams. And this is most often the case for social workers in regional contexts throughout Australia and for many social workers in global south environments. Social work supervision is taught to be a cornerstone of social workers' sustainability and clinical and professional development. But sadly, due to what can sometimes be an isolated environment, social work supervision is not always available. Our podcast is proving to offer elements of social work supervision for many social workers around Australia and the world. When talking about the importance of supervision on the podcast, we're talking about debriefing across the clinical domains of the sector, encouraging self-care, sustaining drive, joy, and professional development and personal effectiveness in their roles. We're receiving regular correspondence from our listeners, as well as our students on placement with us, that the podcast offers them this opportunity. And as the podcast hosts, we then also model a supervisory dialogue in each episode. We're providing an example for students and practitioners to try out in their own supervision sessions in real life. As the hosts, we will purposefully ask listeners to listen out for important themes throughout the episodes, different theories that have been mentioned and enacted, and include conversations that help listeners to debrief the complexity of the issues. And at the end of the episodes, we will then point listeners to further resources to support ongoing learning and development. Mentorship. So we have purposefully structured our podcast to include students as integral members of our podcasting team, and we're really proud of that. Since the launch of the Social Work Stories podcast, we've had social work students on field placements regularly with us, as well as journalism and communication interns. They work with us towards building each unique episode. Social work students are responsible for obtaining the stories, the case studies, and this means they're in direct contact with social workers all the time. They're interviewing, asking probing questions, discussing ethics, working through dilemmas, structuring the story arc, while journalism and communication students have been responsible for editing and producing the episodes, as well as building our important website and social media channels. In this practice, we believe the students are crafting what is heard by the listeners. The episode becomes something they help to create. Their personalities and professional skills can be heard throughout each episode. The students are often spoken about by us as core members of the Social Work Stories podcast team in the episodes, and they're supported and mentored through their time with us. Added to this, the listeners are also mentored by the team. The team are regularly responding to correspondence, asking for advice around careers and professional development in social work. We're mentoring and guiding listeners towards resources and decisions that we hope will help them become more confident and capable social workers. So that's all we have time for in today's presentation, but we hope we've sparked it for you an interest in building a virtual community for students, practitioners, and anyone who might be listening through your podcasting practice.
And look, perhaps we've convinced you somewhat of the notion that a podcast can be more than just an entertaining story or a listening journey, but that it can also be an educational medium that disrupts traditional learning dyads and can create alternative opportunities for students and practitioners and experts and researchers and contributors and listeners to become a community. And importantly, for social work, well, for social workers, I should say, working towards making the world a better place.
We'd love for you to join our listening community, so come check us out at socialworkstories.com or at SOWK Stories Pod, or just search for social work on your favourite podcast platform and we'll be there. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Mim and Ben. Absolutely beautiful virtual silent claps. Thank you. I'm just going to remove your spotlights And I'm going to find Britta. There we are. I'm going to spotlight you. Fabulous.
Hi, I'm glad this is working this time because in the last session I was not able to share my screen, so this is good. So this is basically a presentation about some of the insights I gained into podcasting, about academic research through my PhD, and how podcasting can be used to engage listeners' hearts and minds through storytelling. So it's pretty clear that the intimate voice we hear directly in our headphones drives a lot of that connection, but an aspect of podcasting that is sometimes lost in these discussions is the power of the actual story itself. So the narrative and how it unfolds to keep listeners from tuning out. So I've done a lot of talks about my PhD that were quite theoretical, but this one is a little bit more reflective. And I just wanted to acknowledge as well the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast, my PhD, was made as well. So my PhD, which I finished last year, was a practice-based PhD where I interviewed Australian independent podcast producers and looked at how their independent positioning allowed them to create some really innovative and thought-provoking podcasts. One part of that was experimentation with the podcasting format itself, which I tried to do in making my own series about them. I tried out all kinds of different methods and just played around trying to be as creative as possible with the medium, not just the audio component, but how people might listen, instructions for listening, integrating links and time codes and show notes, and trying to reveal my process in interesting ways. So not everything worked, but it opened up my eyes to the possibility at a time when what a lot of us understand as podcasting is narrowing, which is quite sad. Amid all these wonderful academic podcasts where we hear from researchers themselves, who might be great storytellers talking about great topics with hosts who ask compelling questions and constantly improving audio quality, which does make a difference, I think. Amid all that, with some exceptions, is a bit of an absence of storytelling. So I find myself listening to some of these podcasts, and because they're just kind of a free-flowing discussion that you can dip in and out of, I often don't find that I end up listening right until the end. So I'll put them on while I'm doing some kind of task, and then I'll turn them off when I'm finished doing that task. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but to me, it's a little bit sad because podcasting does have this great ability to really grip and immerse the listener right until the end.
There's this thing called podcasts.
Like, it equally
What a crazy idea.
drives me fucking crazy and excites
I
me.
think the most exciting Australian audio is happening in that space.
There's so many things that podcasting hasn't done yet that it's going to do, that it's about
It's a really
to do.
exciting space to be in.
I think it's going to be shaken up more in the next couple of years in a really exciting way. This is actually going to be a thing.
If we all banded together, you could create something really awesome.
I went from doing nothing like this ever before to being known for having done this.
That's why there's so many people coming out and just kind of like recording something on their mobile phone where they and their friends just talk to each other for an hour and then they upload it, and that's the podcast.
I think we really have to pause at this point because we're at this weird turning point.
So that was just a little clip from the podcast series I made to give you a sense of what it kind of sounded like. This next slide is a very crudely drawn slide of the 3-act structure idea, which has become a huge cliche in podcasting, I think, particularly because of This American Life. But I always include it in talks I give to new producers, at least to get them thinking about storytelling structure. And I think this is notably missing from the vast majority of educational and academic podcasts, which are often interview-based rather than documentary style. But even if you aren't making a documentary style podcast, I think you still need to think about structure if you want to hold your listeners right until the end. A free-flowing format might work if you're dealing with light topics or interviewing a scientist or researcher who's just exceptionally charismatic or good at telling stories. But academic podcasts themselves can be really complex and very conceptual and often quite heavy. So I think it's even more important to pay attention to the structure, asking how can you hook that listener right from the start? How can you raise questions so the listener will want to stay with you right through all that complexity so that they can find out the answers? So my PhD, like all research projects, was driven by a lot of confusing and complicated ideas and questions. And I kept making episode drafts about these that just weren't interesting. I kept thinking about my fellow podcast studies researchers and also producers who are the target audience for my episodes, and whether they would want to sit down and listen to just another conversation about podcasting when they've probably been doing that all day. I tried to ask myself what would make people want to listen to this rather than just listen because they're interested in the ideas, because it might as well have been a written piece if in the end the format isn't given that much consideration. But I found in making my PhD series, it's kind of difficult in podcasting to try and make a topic seem interesting if it isn't. That intimacy that podcast creates means that listeners can usually quite easily pick up on whether something is authentic or forced. You need to find the elements that make any kind of story interesting. So the emotion, the humor, the action, the little anecdotes, the character development, and even in an interview-based podcast, you can find those elements, however minor, through things like pre-interviewing. And this isn't to say that a rigid narrative structure with those 3 acts is necessary for a compelling podcast. And in fact, I'd really argue we need much more expanded and creative approaches. But podcasts for learning and sharing research that are just interviews with experts laying out the basics and coming to a couple of surprising conclusions are often limiting the audience to people who've already invested in the topic, who might only be listening because they feel like they should. And it would be really sad if we kept talking about this great new tool to engage people's hearts and minds, but then didn't really think deeply about how to do that in practice. My experience making these types of podcasts are that it can be really tricky. It takes time and creativity. And even though I'd been making audio and radio stories for quite a while before my PhD, I still thought that if I just thought creatively enough, I could find my way around some of the more boring parts of the topics I was exploring. I could make them interesting with some cleverly thought out audio tricks. I thought surely a project where I get 4 years to think about all of this will lead me to discover those tricks. But I came to the realization that at the heart of a really good academic or research podcast is a really good story. So having more research-based goals for your podcast can limit your ability to be experimental in some ways, because you have a very specific set of goals and topics to cover. But if you can find those stories, I think that's when you can use the podcast medium to its full potential. Yep.
Fabulous. Thank you. So many really, really fascinating questions, thought-provoking questions that I'm sure people are listening are going to engage with as we continue in this session and then open up for discussion towards the end. Thank you, Britta. I'm now going to invite Elizabeth to present. I'm just finding you. There we are. So I can spotlight you.
Thanks, Narelle.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Elizabeth Diakos from Larksong Enterprises, and I'm a career transition coach for educators. So I help teachers get out of teaching and into a life they love. And I'm going to share my screen with you now, and hopefully no judging about the state of my desktop, please. Okay, so I have a podcast that I started early last year called the Get Out of Teaching podcast. So basically what's in the can is on the lid, so you know exactly what you're letting yourself in for when you listen to this podcast. And why did I do that, and why am I bringing this to an education podcast conference might be a fair question to ask. I was having so many conversations with teachers who were wanting to leave teaching, but who just felt so stressed and anxious about it and overwhelmed by the possibility of leaving a career that might be all they've known in their working life. And they felt like they didn't have the mindset or the skills to make a good transition. And they might have felt also that they had no options. And I knew that there were people out there who left teaching, because as I was considering working with this clientele, I just put a post in the business group, the Facebook group, Like-Minded Bitches Drinking Wine, and I got over 100 responses from teachers who had set up themselves in business just in a couple of days. So I knew they were out there. I knew I was onto something. And so I put out the call into a few business groups and said, are there any teachers who would be willing to come on a podcast? And that was how I got my first guests. And so season 1 and season 2 of the podcast were really those stories. and hearing the stories of the teachers and how they got out, the reasons for leaving, the legacy that they wanted to leave in the world. And so the purpose really was to show social proof to the teachers that I work with as clients, to say, hey, look, here are all these stories of teachers who've actually made it out of the classroom and doing something else. And also just to give them some hope, a bit of inspiration and encouragement. So that was season 1 and 2. And these are pretty much the questions that I asked them. So just about their story and what they were afraid of, and then what skills did they bring out of education and into their next career, and what would they say to someone who was stuck. I always end on that legacy question, and that's turned out to be really valuable for actually, I had a recent client and she said, oh, I can't even answer that question. I'm like, wow, really? Like, she'd been teaching for 30 odd years and she didn't feel she had left a legacy. And so, but actually she listened to some of the podcast episodes. She said, oh, now I know what you're talking about. I think I will be able to create something that I could call a legacy. So that's really very gratifying actually to hear that. In terms of so that was season 1 and 2. Season 3, I actually did coaching calls. So it was only a short season of 10 episodes. And they were coaching conversations with me. And some of them were people who I'd never even met prior to that conversation. They just booked a call with me. And I said, hey, while we're here, do you mind if I record this and also share it with a much wider audience? And so there were a couple of people who were willing to do that. And the idea is, of course, to show people, if you talk to me, you know, it's going to be okay. And so part of the reason for doing those particular calls was that. And then season 4 is really about helping, talking to the people who help people leave and transition into new jobs. So I've been interviewing HR experts, resume writing experts, LinkedIn profile people, other career coaches. So all the people that you go to when you need help to make that transition. In terms of the stats, this is my little download. I don't know what happened here. Something exciting happened in about August. October's looking a bit bleak, but that's because we're only 6 days in. So it'll go up as the days go by. And actually I took this photo at about 11 o'clock this morning, and then it's gone up already by how many? Gone from 7,946 to 7,967 in a couple of hours. So that's good. But today was the new episode came out today, so you would expect that. So you can see that I didn't really know what I should say on this, so I just thought I'll just talk about the things that I find interesting, and if you'll find them interesting, hopefully that's good. So Apple is clearly the winner here in terms of where they're going to get their listening, and there are some people going to Buzzsprout. So Buzzsprout's a hosting platform, and it kind of links to all the other hosting platforms, all the other podcast hosts. But Buzzsprout enables me to select a particular episode. So if I want to say to someone, hey, you should listen to, episode 7 of season 2, I can send them directly to that episode with a Buzzsprout link. So that's why that's probably abnormally high. I think most people would naturally just go to Apple. My most famous guest was Gabby Stroud, who's the author of the book Teacher. And also I think that was the longest episode, because she's got the gift of the gab, which was awesome, because a lot of people in the Facebook group, particularly the Australians, would be really interested in hearing her story of how she left the classroom. In terms of the audience, this is the spread. Mostly down under, but quite a lot in North America as well. And my Facebook group is about this, actually it's probably the other way around. There's more Americans than there are Aussies in my Facebook group. But most popular city is Sydney. And then you can see the States is coming in a sad second, but you've got California and Washington. And I know in the Facebook group, a lot of my members of that are in Dallas, but they don't seem to be showing up on the podcast stats. So maybe they don't listen to podcasts. This is Zoe Fox, who created the music intro and outro for me. I really struggled to find something that I could use legally. And so in the end, I hired Zoe, who's the daughter of one of my ex-colleagues, and she created the music. And actually, I don't know how this will work with Zoom, but I'm going to try if I can I'll just let you hear a bit of it. It's a little bit annoying, but. So that's just the start of the jingle. And the idea was that I wanted something that was kind of bright and cheerful so that it, was a bit inspiring and uplifting. And this is my setup. It's pretty basic. So and that's where I am now. So that's the view out the window that I can see right now. And, you're seeing what's behind me. One of my clients sent me this lovely message the other day, and I just thought I'd share that with you. And that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's really nice to hear your insights and your approach and all the different elements there, which is just spectacular. I'll remove the spotlight from you, and I am now going to introduce our final presenters with Christy. I'm going to spotlight, and Ash. Just finding Ash as we move through. Let's see. Ash, give me a wave. I can't find you in our screen of people.
Oh dear, I'm here.
Oh, I can hear
Jump
you.
up on the little icon. Yep, I also have one of our graphics, one of our podcast professionals.
Oh, there you are. Found you. I found you. I found you. Beautiful. There we are. So thank you.
Thanks, Narelle, and thank you very much to yourself and Mia for including us in the conference. We're very excited, quite nervous. So Christy and I are both professional staff at Swinburne, and welcome to our episode, our special episode of the podcast Professionals with Christy and Ash. And this is our podcast made by professional staff for professional staff. And I have already jumped the gun in my nerves and not given Christy my
intro music. Oh, look, we're keen. We're very keen.
And so our podcast very much, and our theme of our podcast, our song, our aim is really engaging with staff. So, which is why we're at the Engaging Our Hearts and Minds Through Audio, as mentioned. My name's Ash Carden, and let me introduce my partner in crime, partner in pod, Christy Horn. Welcome, Christy.
Thanks, Ash. Another great intro as always. Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Horn, and I am the other half of the podcast Professionals with Christy and Ash. And thank you so much for listening to our presentation. We're super pumped to be here tonight and to talk you through our story. So why don't we just jump right on in and tell you all how this fun roller coaster of a podcast got started. Sometimes things just happen, and sometimes it's by chance or it's by coincidence where things just happen and they can take on a life of their own. And sometimes this can be an excellent opportunity. You know the feeling when you have an idea, and once the ball starts to roll and momentum begins, and it might be slowly at first, and then it starts gaining speed faster and faster. And before you know it, you're knee deep in and wonder, oh my God, how did this happen? Well, this is the story of how this happened. So over to you, Ash.
Late in 2020, the university's professional staff network had put a call out for committee members. Christy and myself both found ourselves on this committee, and as team members and colleagues across the university what we were trying to achieve is how to connect with people without having the chance to be in the office. So both of us said, yes, we wanted to help. Christy and I really enjoy working together and have banter. One idea led to another and someone said podcast. And then, yes, we were going to start a podcast despite having zero knowledge. We jumped right in as a different way of engaging with staff. And this was our podcast with that purpose, to connect and reconnect with staff.
So the process was really simple. Step one, Google how to create a podcast. And step two, learn how to use Adobe Audition. Oh, and plus find the record button. And what do I use? Single track, multi-track, waveform, tech issues, headphones not working, the whole lot. But after some planning and minimal practicing, Ash and I jumped right in and recorded our first ever podcast. And yes, we did it, folks. We kicked it off by interviewing the chair of the SPSN network, the awesome Nicola Howard. And yes, it was a bit rough. In fact, it was a lot rough around the edges. But you know what? We did it and we recorded it in one take, which still is our number one rule. Right, Ash?
For better or for worse.
But Ash and I could not have imagined what happened next. So let me share this with you guys. The amazing community of Swinburne staff collectively put their arms around us, and offers of help came in from all corners of our amazing organisation. First came the offer to create the artwork and our logo by Nicola Howard. Then came an offer from the Adobe Creative Campus coaches to help us navigate around the software, plus some much needed one-on-one coaching. Thank you, Felix. You know what, it was really starting to roll and starting to gain some momentum, but there's more. With post-production done, Ash and I were feeling proud as punch and, you know, like real podcasters, albeit with our old plates firmly on. So why don't you tell us what happened next, Ash?
So as we've created this podcast with a loose idea to interview colleagues and just recreate conversations to share, we're then having all these conversations generated by the podcast. Outside of the podcast, we've had calls from the media team so we could understand some of the sound recording studios and have use of those. We are hoping to get actually one of our very own students to guide us in our production of the podcast. There was next then the hosting. So we had no real idea of how much that it took and to get a podcast working, and then the Swinburne Commons team. So many people, so many of our team members that we wouldn't have met without a podcast, and frankly without hybrid working, are starting to help us and support us get this podcast together. So that both the podcast and the community around us really was connecting, reconnecting and creating new connections in ways that we could not have anticipated.
So we had the opportunity to chat with some excellent staff at Swinburne. We call them VIP guests because that's what they are. So let's quickly just share with you some of these amazing people that we got to chat to. In episode number 1 was the SPSN chair, Nicola Howard. And she was able to talk to us about her business. Oh yeah. Okay. She was able to talk to us about her working at Swinburne University. She's an amazing artist and a Swinburne legend. She got us to connect and reconnect with staff. So that was episode number 1. And number 2, are you there, Ash? I keep going.
I am here. I'm experiencing some current technical difficulty in the form of a young child.
No worries. Episode 2, yeah, so episode 2 was with Mari Norden and Timothy Werner, who are part of the Indigenous Strategy and Engagement Specialists in the Diversity and Inclusion team here at Swinburne. Next one, Ash.
So, and we also spoke to Rita Barbagallo. She's one of the facility managers in the school operations team for business law and entrepreneurship. We had our parental leave special edition. That was a requested topic on Yammer. So part of the podcast generating that conversation on Yammer also influences the topics that we are having in future podcasts.
Perfect. The next one, actually, we just laughed our way through, was with Daniel Dunn, who's the Centre Manager for CTI here at Swinburne University. He's been around the traps at Swinburne for a long time. So it was great to shine a spotlight on Daniel and what he's been able to do at Swinburne University. And the next episode was with the very glamorous and the gorgeous Dominique Goodwin, who is a manager within the industry and engagement and does a lot of work with Swinburne and the Acme studio. So, excuse me, to talk to Dominique was absolutely fantastic. We also had a special guest of one of Ash's cats. And finally, to cap it off, we have just recorded episode number 7 of the podcast Professionals with Christy and Ash. Still connecting and reconnecting with staff, but in an alumni kind of way. In this episode, we had the honour of speaking with Paralympian and Swinburne alumni Matt Levy. Matt had just returned from his 5th Paralympic Games, and he was kind enough to chat to us in quarantine about his journey and his gold medal world record 100-metre freestyle medley swim in Tokyo. Plus, we got a scoop on life inside the Athletes Village. It was a really great chat, and I was actually able to sneak in a bit of banter about dancing around the handbag on the dance floor with Matt. Kind of made me giggle. I think he thought it was a bit nuts, but that's okay. We are super grateful to our Swinburne colleagues who make the time to chat with us and to encourage us to learn new skills and to give us the confidence to keep going. So we are really happy to have been given the opportunity and to have created the podcast Professionals for the SPSN network, and to continue to connect with Swinburne staff at the same time continuing to engage our hearts and minds through audio. So as we mentioned in the beginning, sometimes things just happen, and look what's happened. It's just great. Thank you so much for taking the time to hear our story. We really hope you can take the time to listen to the podcast Professionals with Christy and Ash sitting on.
And feel free to give us any suggestions. What started as recreating corridor conversations when we're all working from home has been an amazing journey of learning and connecting that we could not have anticipated.
And this is our mic drop moment.
This is our mic drop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm doing a little clap that can be heard.
Thanks, Mia.
And I think what we've heard in these 4 presentations is really how versatile podcasting is. But there's been some keywords that have come through around connection, community, the element of surprise. That's something that Ash and Christy talked about, and that you don't quite know where it's going to develop into. Talked about inspiration, purpose, meaning, all these words that I think podcast listeners know. I would say, at least I've had this experience, and I'd be surprised if you hadn't had it as well, where you're listening to something and it really shifts your understanding of whatever it is the story is about. You kind of go, oh, and then you don't go back from that. It actually can really change the way you think or you remember things. I can often remember exactly where I am, where I've been walking, listening to something. I know which part of the Yarra Bend park that I walk in, where I've listened to a particular piece of podcast. So let's have some questions for the panelists. We've got another few minutes left of the Victorian evening, So throw some questions, please. We've got some coming through. So Georgia, the question of did you find it important to have different people on every episode, not recurring guests? Is that for Ash and Christy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
oh, sorry.
Did you get that question? Sorry.
Yes, no, absolutely. And yes, so part of the podcast professionals was also about making those chance work conversations and that engagement available to everyone. So not only do we try and have different guests from different areas of the university, but also thinking more about areas that we wouldn't normally engage or connect with, and trying to get suggestions from the community just to really spread that out as fairly as we can.
Thank you.
Can I jump in with a question about artwork? Because that's also something that has really stood out to me in the presentation so far. And of course, Abby in her keynote talked about that. And as a design expert, she really understands the importance of it. But we also have seen it, of course, in Christy and Ash. And Britta, you had some artwork as well. So can I invite you to talk about the importance of artwork with your podcasts?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. The lady who created our artwork is Swinburne, Nicola Howard. She's the chair of the SPSN network. And she designed these little Swinburne avatars that sort of link into Swintopia as well. And when we got to join in on this pod conference, I asked her if she'd design us a mic drop, and she just draws them freehand. So yeah, it's really good. And we've used it. You can see in our presentation, I had it on nearly every single slide on purpose, not because it's so ace, but it's the logo, and we're going to continue using that. And so now we might deviate away with the, I didn't put it in, but in our panel discussion with the parental leave, she drew us another one which had us in nappies, and we were little babies, not holding our coffee cups, but we were holding bottles. I forgot to put that one in, but yeah, so it is really important, and we'll just keep sticking with that exact same theme.
Rita, did you want to talk about your artwork?
Yeah, sure. So the artwork is by my friend Ran Zhao. She's actually my high school friend, and she's a very brilliant artist. And I actually asked her to do some drawings for as part of my PhD, to go with the podcast series at the very start when there wasn't so much of a format of what maybe the art would look like. So her drawings are very, very detailed and big and colorful and stuff, and maybe not what you'd associate with kind of podcast art. And I kind of like that because it seems very unusual now, like a few years later. Yeah.
And I guess also because so much of podcasting, we talked about, or Siobhan talked about, the linear aspect and the temporal aspect of podcasting, which means that you can't capture it in a sense. And we know also that sharing audio on social platforms is not so easy. People just don't pick it up quite in the same way. So in terms of having artwork, how important is that to grab people's attention?
So in terms of, I think what we found with the Professional Staff Network, and it's about having a visual connection to the audio information for our staff, something that for our listeners and staff and colleagues that people can connect with for us, because it is about those employee conversations. Having little friendly, funny avatars of ourselves is sort of that first visual cue to what our podcast is about. So for us, that's been really crucial, rather than just giving people photos of us and our cats, which comes with a little bit of time after you get to know us. But I think that first impression and people's perception, I think, has been really important of how interested they are with engaging of that first view.
Elizabeth and also Mim and Ben, have you got any thoughts on artwork or the visual representation of your podcasts?
Yeah, thanks, Mia. So mine is actually the little lark, the silhouette of the lark is actually my logo that I designed, like literally cut out the shape and sprayed it with spray ink. That's in the background. I've since had it kind of revamped a bit, so now it's the positive version of the same image. But yeah, so that's what's in the background, and it's just got a picture of me, which is not very flattering, but but I was really going for clarity, that you could read it on your phone, or that you could see what it was, which podcast it was. So that was kind of where I was coming from. But the lark is really nice because it's sort of flying upwards, so it's got this nice uplifting feel, and that's really what I was going for with the whole thing, is to make it uplifting. So thanks.
For us, and Ben and Justin, our other producer, he's also here on as well with us today. We came up with our logo quite early on, and now we're at the point where we're over 300,000 downloads. And so there's people listening around the world. And when they say to us, which social work podcast are you? It's really important that we can say the one with the big grey microphone. Right. And then, straight away it'll come up because it's, we're up there in the top podcast, which is great. But I think it's really important for branding. I think it's important that people know, they go on Twitter, they see that grey microphone, they know it's us. They go on Instagram, they see it everywhere. And so for us, it's not so much about the artwork as the logo and the marketing and the branding. I don't know, Ben and Justin, whether you guys want to comment on that as well.
Only just to follow up with, in the same way that the visual is a brand for us, so is our music and our intro. I mean, we were all jiving to that intro just a moment ago from Christy and Ash, and ours is similarly quite unique. And as soon as you hear it, you're like, oh, that's the Social Work Stories podcast. And so it's a big part of who we are and what we align ourselves to. That song that we use is all about social justice and the social justice movement around the world. And so it means a lot to us, that choice of music. But now means a lot to our listeners as well, because it signals that this is the Social Work Stories podcast.
And we also had an episode where we had the singer on the podcast episode and talked to him about where that song comes from and linked it to social issues that were happening at the time globally. So it became quite an important continuing theme for our podcast.
And I think just added to that is, I mean, we don't see social work solely as a clinical practice, although it is. We also see social work as art. Social work is a practice in art. We call it an art of social work sometimes. And so, yeah, we just like that connection between the visual, the audio, and that kind of melds together those worlds.
I just wanted to add, I wanted to keep it consistent as well, the same intro music and the same logo, although we've got variations of it, but it's almost identical, just to keep that consistency. So when people are tuning in, it's like, oh, okay, it's podcast professionals, but it's an Adobe free piece of music. But yeah, I really wanted to keep that exactly the same as well. So yeah, agree with you there.
And great, that really illustrates also, I think, from all the answers that, music doesn't just happen. Interviews don't just happen. The logo or the artwork just doesn't just happen out of it. So it really articulates all the different steps of podcast production and all the decisions that are made. There's a question for Britta from Natasha. Of the stories you've uncovered for your podcast, so have you a favourite or any challenges in uncovering the story for a particular topic?
I guess probably my favorite kind of story was like the similar stories of all the producers that I spoke to who sort of came into podcasting in like the mid 2010s when it wasn't so popular, and just their like excitement about what podcasting could be and how that journey kind of was quite similar through all the producers, like that they just thought it was so open and you could be so creative. And I guess that's I wasn't sure how to tell that story, but that opening that I played is kind of part of how I tried to show that this community of people, or this group of people, kind of felt that similar kind of journey. So that was probably, my favorite.
Thank you. I think that's such a lovely place to end day one. I'm going to invite Narelle to take us out.
Thank you. Thank you to those wonderful presentations and the Q&A there. And for those that have sort of been with us all the way through and connected in and out, thank you so much for participating and forming and being a part of this community as well. I don't know that I'm going to sleep tonight. My brain is going all over the place with thoughts, inspiration. I've taken 5 pages of notes already. It's just spectacular. So thank you so much personally, and I'm sure that many of you feel the same way as well. So day 2 tomorrow is very sort of practical based. We'll actually probably answer a lot of questions that are sitting in the chat in terms of the how-to around music, or how do you plan? What do you do with interviewing? How do you get that intimacy that we've all been talking about? So we've got a beautiful keynote, which is going to do a live podcast recording, and then we'll dissect it. We move into a beautiful session with Tash that looks at Adobe Audition, learning how to do it. But we are doing this really cool session where we investigate how we interview and seek out that voice in a really beautiful way that we also want to have in our audio experiences. And we're going to use that interview to then become the audio that we edit as we learn audition, and also develop some of those skills as well. And we're going to end our day with a tech talk. So we have David joining us, who loves technology, mics, and anything and everything that comes with producing the best audio ever. So he's going to do a little mini presentation, but very much open up to a significant part of that session for a Q&A as well. So watch out for those links with your registration with Eventbrite. All those sessions have different links because they're coming with different teams. Thank you so much for an inspiring day. For those who are ending the day, rest up. For those that are just starting your day, I hope you're inspired, share the love. There's been lots of activity on Twitter. Continue that going. And thank you so much for a wonderful day 1 of this podcast conference. Thanks so much, everybody.